his mindset was, I will direct whatever can be directed from Berlin, but I'm not going on the run. I'm not going to be some, hounded dog. Stalin begins to sort of change the narrative where he said, well, was he dead? Did he die in Berlin?
So, Roger Moorhouse, we are here to do a very short On This Day podcast where we are going to talk about a day in history and tease out everything you need to know and the books you need to read. And the day today is the 30th of April. And what happened on the 30th of April, 1945, Roger Moorhouse?
Dun, dun, dun. Hitler dies. Spoiler alert, he died. 1945 in the bunker in Berlin.
Now, the reason you had to give a spoiler alert is because we're going to talk about the day itself and we're going to talk about the death of Hitler, but we are also going to use it as a springboard to talk about a subject that is very dear to your heart, which is the sort of ongoing conspiracy theories about Hitler being alive and well and sort of popping up in
presumably not now. He can't be still alive now. Because he would be,
okay, all right.
Do the maths, he would be 137, I think. But,
You can't kill evil, Roger.
No, you can't. It's very true. It's very true.
Looking at your bookshelf, if he is alive and well, he'd feel right at home in your study. He'd be like, look at all these books about me.
He'd be very happy.
Yeah.
Some of them are even in German.
Luckily... Luckily, he's not hiding under Roger Moorhouse's desk as we record this podcast. So let's get into it, Roger. 30th of April, 1945. Set the scene. The days before, where are we? What's happening?
Yeah, so Hitler had kind of essentially retired to the bunker by this point, and he's in this weird sort of netherworld, deep below the garden of the Reich Chancellery in the middle of Berlin, where he's increasingly, directing sort of armies that no longer exist on the surface. So the Soviets, the Red Army, have encircled Berlin. They've destroyed whatever armies stood in their way. There's a great battle called the Battle of Halbe, which is absolute destruction of one German army group off to the west of Berlin. So that it really sort of shadows of the forces that have been fighting for so many years by that point. And the Soviets are basically advancing into the centre of Berlin. They're already on the square outside the Reichstag. So the battle for the Reichstag is about to sort of reach its climax as well. They're at the Potsdamer Platz, which is about a mile away from Hitler's bunker. They're also at a place called the Weidendammer Bridge, which is about a mile in the other direction. So you can see that the noose is tightening around the area of the Chancellery in the bunker. And Hitler has actually, weirdly, just to sort of preface some of these conspiracy theories and so on, he has had a number of opportunities to escape. Were he minded to do so, he could have done so, right? So there was this sort of a number of aircraft, I think it was 10 aircraft actually, left Berlin a few days before. I think it's called Operation Seraglio, to go down to Berchtesgaden. They took a lot of staff, they took a lot of documents. I mean, a couple of them actually crashed en route. So there was a sort of a mass evacuation down to Berchtesgaden down in the south, but Hitler didn't go.
And why do you think that Hitler chose to stay? What was the motivation?
I think in his case, it's to a large extent, well, two things. I think partly exhaustion. He's very ill actually at this point. It is disputed and it wasn't properly diagnosed at the time, but if you look at footage of Hitler in the last year of his life, it's pretty clear that he has Parkinson's. He'd suffered, his health had really collapsed after the assassination attempt of the previous summer, Klaus von Stauffenberg. So his health is pretty bad at this point. He's only 56, right? But his health is really bad at this point.
Roger, are you now older than Hitler was when he died?
I am.
Oh,
which
God.
is
I'm so
frankly
sorry.
terrifying. But yes, sorry.
Anyway, sorry. Rabbit hole.
Yeah,
Carry on.
rabbit hole. Yeah, so his health's pretty bad. And I think also his life, I mean, unlike Stalin in a weird way, Hitler had never really been a fugitive, right? He'd been, a down and out and stuff, but then become a politician, and had always been, since 1920, the foundation of the Nazi Party, he's basically been a politician. So he's not used to the life of a fugitive, and he didn't fancy it. He was a sick 56-year-old man. So he kind of, his mindset was, I will direct whatever can be directed from Berlin, but I'm not going on the run. I'm not going to be some, hounded dog.
Yeah, I mean, you think it was kind of as much logistics as sort of ideology. It wasn't a kind of, you know, last stand of the kind of Aryan myth. Like he has to kind of go down fighting. I mean, that's not part
I
of
mean,
it.
there is that sort of, I suppose, there's a bit something Wagnerian about it. This is Götterdämmerung. This is the twilight of the gods and all of that. So maybe he was a great aficionado of Wagner. So maybe there's an element of that in his own mind, that it's a sort of a heroic downfall. But I think it's more practical things. He is a sick man, and he doesn't fancy life on the run in an ever shrinking sort of pocket of German controlled territory.
And presumably he fancies even less being imprisoned by the Soviets.
Exactly. So that informs the sort of circumstances of his suicide, and then the disposal of his body, is that he actually really does not want to end up as a sort of a trophy for the Soviets to then parade around Berlin, whether alive or dead. He doesn't want that to happen to him.
And do we know that he's seen the photos of Mussolini's ignominious stringing up in a petrol station?
No, I think that, again, it's one of those little stories that I think that aspect does it inform his decision, but the idea of him actually seeing pictures of it is probably unlikely, because that was a few days before, and the chances of pictures being taken, printed, and then reproduced and then presented to Hitler in those few days in the circumstances of the collapse of the end of the war, pretty unlikely. But it's also pretty unlikely that he wouldn't have been told that Mussolini had been captured, cornered, lynched basically, and then his body strung up and sort of ritually humiliated by angry Italians. So he would have known that those were the circumstances, and he was adamant that wasn't going to happen to him.
Okay. So the day itself, is there a tipping point? Is there a moment where he understands that that's his only way out to avoid the Mussolini fate?
The decision's really been made probably at least a day, if not a day and a half before. I think his decision to marry Eva Braun, which is made on the night of the 28th, so that's when all of that happens. That is probably the moment where he knows he's going to end his own life there in the bunker, right? So,
and does she know?
She knows as well. I mean, she's made the decision. Again, she could have gone down to Berchtesgaden. She's made the decision long since to sort of stick with him to the bitter end. So she knows as well. Yeah, it's absolutely right. If anything, that's the decision. And he'd been told, 2 days before, that essentially the defenses that they had around Berlin were going to be insufficient to keep the Soviets out, to keep them at bay. So at that point, he's already making that decision, because he has decides to marry Eva Braun and sort of make the honest woman of her. That morning really is sort of weirdly normal in Hitler's life. The main abnormality of it is that he gets up very early. Hitler was really quite dilettantish in his ways. He was the sort of guy that got up late in the morning, after a late night. Now, he actually went to bed very late the night before. He got up at about 6, probably woken, quite tellingly, probably woken by Soviet artillery fire. Woke up at about 6, had some breakfast. He had a situation conference in the morning with some of his senior commanders, where they confirmed, where the Soviets were at that point. As I said, Potsdamer Platz, Weidendamer Brücke, and at the Reichstag. So they're, a mile away in each direction. And that, if there were any doubt, that would have made up his mind that, today was the day. And then there's this sort of very weird lunch that he has with his secretaries. Eva Braun ducks out of this, so she goes to the apartment. There's a small sort of room, a small apartment within the bunker. She ducks out of the lunch, but he has lunch with his secretaries, and this is in the testimony, excuse me, the testimony of Travel Junge, who's one of the secretaries that was there and survived the war and so on, and lived. I think she only died in about 2002. And Hitler was very normal, a little bit subdued. The conversation, weirdly, and conversation with his secretaries often would take sort of weird turns. There's one account, I think it was from Christa Schroeder, who was one of the other secretaries, who talked about him once. He used to rail against them wearing lipstick. You didn't dare wear lipstick around Hitler. So there was this one lunch that they had where one of them dared to wear lipstick, and then he told them where lipstick came from, and he said it was made from the fat that had been scraped from the walls of Paris sewers. Right? I mean, this is Hitler's belief system. And then on this particular day, the last day of his life, he regales his secretaries. Is that the right word? I don't know. With his thoughts on the correct conditions for mating dogs, which, I mean, again, as an insight into Hitler's sort of mind, it's an interesting one. Anyway, he's quite subdued. Lunch is over. He then sort of calls his entourage to him, and they sort of all line up, and he goes down the line with Eva Braun. There's a few sort of muttered words between them, not much. It's sort of weirdly unemotional, I think, for a lot of them. Some of the secretaries are upset by this because they know what's coming. And then eventually, after that, he disappears into the apartment, and the next thing everyone else hears is a gunshot. And that is the end of Hitler. Now, the precise circumstances of his death are still disputed, which is weird. And that's one of the things that sort of feeds into the conspiracy theories, right? But for reasons we can go into, well, we don't know.
What do you mean?
We know, for example, so Eva Braun, it's pretty clear Eva Braun took cyanide, right? The circumstances being what they are, it's most likely that Hitler would have made sure that she was dead, because, again, that thing about being a trophy, he didn't want that. And he didn't want that for her either. So he would have made sure that she was dead, presumably. And then he would have killed himself. Now, it's disputed precisely how he killed himself. There is a gunshot, right? We know that because there are numerous eyewitnesses to the sound of the gunshot. When they go in,
Moorhouse.
Ear witnesses. Okay, so when they go into the apartment soon after, there's blood on the sofa. Hitler's dead, slumped over. Eva Braun's next to him. Whether he shoots himself in the temple or in the mouth, we don't know, and it's disputed either way. There are various accounts. Some of the eyewitnesses say different things. It's not clear from what remains there are of him which one was done. So that is not precisely clear, but the body is there. They're both wrapped in blankets and so on, taken upstairs. He had given orders to his adjutant that morning to go and requisition 200 litres of fuel, which, given that what remaining tanks of the German army in Berlin basically were running out of fuel that morning, that's a pretty big ask. I mean, 200 litres of fuel is a hell of a lot for the purpose of burning the bodies. So the bodies are taken out. I
see. So he wants his body to be burned so that there's no possibility
he can be
humiliated even in death.
Exactly. So he can't be strung up like Mussolini, in the same way. So he wanted his body to be destroyed. Yeah.
Can I just ask a quick question? The people left in the bunker, how do they feel about his suicide? Are they angry with him for leaving? Do they expect him to leave? Is anybody angry with him for prolonging the war for so long and wreaking such devastation on Germany after it was obvious they were going to lose? I mean, what's the kind of... Or are they loyal to him even to the end?
Yeah, I think it's that loyalty. There's a great scene on that last day, which I haven't mentioned, which is when Magda Goebbels, one of the last sort of people that sort of pleads. I mean, she She loved Hitler. She was died in the wall Nazi. She loved Nazism. She loved, all of that. That was her world. And Magda Goebbels, of course, is instrumental in killing her 6 children the following day, right? Which is, just listen to those words. She killed her 6 children, and she killed them because she couldn't imagine them growing up in a world without Nazism, without Adolf Hitler. That was the depth of her belief, right? That she did that. So on that morning, when Hitler's last morning, she sort of, where everyone's being quite kind of self-contained, and the women are being very demure and not showing their emotion too much. Magda Goebbels sort of rushes through and sort of pleads with him and cries and pleads with him, not to kill himself and to escape south, to take the opportunity to escape south and continue the project, sort of thing. And he refuses. He refuses and pushes her away in a sort of gentle way, but and then backs into his apartment to commit suicide. So the mood to answer your question, the mood of those that remain in the entourage is one of absolute faith in him and the project and all of that. There is a degree of relief, I think, for some of them, because it means now, if once he's dead, it means that they can try and escape. Because as it is, they're just because they're just sitting in a trap, right, waiting for the Soviets to arrive. They're pretty clear what will happen when the Soviets do arrive. They're under no illusions; it's going to be brutal. So I think with some of them, there's a degree of relief that now they can at least try and escape, which they do after Hitler's death.
Okay, so the bodies. Did they find the fuel? Are the bodies burnt?
Yeah, they find pretty much all of the fuel that was required, and the bodies are then sort of laid out, doused with that fuel and lit, and burned. They burn for a pretty good long time in the Chancellery Garden. So it's those remains that are found by the Soviets when they arrive, following day, the day after.
So the remains are unrecognisable.
Yes. Very, very badly burnt. There's no moustache. No, there's no moustache. There's sort of telling detail. Interestingly, the same fate actually happens to Goebbels' body the following day. So his body is burnt, along with Magda Goebbels. Not far from where Hitler's body was burnt, and Goebbels, of course, had a club foot, so he had like a caliper on his leg, and that was there. So it's pretty clear which body was Goebbels' one, because he had a caliper on the lower leg. But Hitler's what remained of Hitler wasn't particularly recognizable. It becomes significant later on, because once you get the Soviets arrive, and Smersh, particularly Soviet intelligence, military intelligence, arrive, and they're desperate to know precisely what's happened to Hitler, of course, right? So I think a couple of days later, they all arrive and sort of swarm around, and there's a sort of a frenzy both of souvenir taking and collection of evidence. And the two sort of overlap in a rather chaotic way. So this is partly why the narrative of precisely, how Hitler killed himself, for example, and things like that, precisely why that's a bit clouded, is because of the sort of chaotic circumstances of the time. But they are at least keen to know what happened to Hitler. If nothing else, because they need to know whether they have to chase him somewhere else, right? So they, although the remains that are in the Chancellery Garden are all sort of, secured, they're actually, I think from memory, there are about 18 corpses or remains of corpses in the Chancellery Garden, which is pretty horrific. And they're all sort of crated up and boxed up. And what was significant about Hitler's remains was his teeth. And this becomes very significant in the identification of his remains. So one of those that was important in this investigation was a woman called Yelena Zhevskaya. And she wrote a memoir, actually, that came out not long ago, where she talks about this whole experience. She worked initially as an interpreter with Smersh, and was in that team that was involved in the investigation. So they actually tracked down Hitler's dentist. And Hitler's dentist himself had left Berlin, but they tracked down the dental assistants, and there were two of them. The woman was called Kette Häusermann, I remember, and Hitler had really, really bad teeth, right? Throughout his life, there's lots of accounts of people close to Hitler sort of staggering back when they talk to him, staggering back away from him because he had such bad halitosis, right? So he had a sweet tooth, probably had genetically bad teeth anyway. But by the end of his life, so aged 56, he had precisely 6 of his own teeth in his mouth. Everything else was crowns and dentures. Yeah. Really, really bad teeth. So he actually had some really elaborate dentistry. And the most telling thing was what they called a telephone bridge, which was a gold bridge that sort of spanned across either a denture or a real tooth, but it located the 2 teeth either side so that the whole thing sort of held together, right? So this telephone bridge was very, very significant in his dental work. So very, 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 very particular dental work had been done on his mouth. So the Soviets tracked down this dental assistant, Kette Häusermann, and sort of, dragged her in, and they said, right, sketch Hitler's teeth, do it now. Which she did from memory, and it's very distinctive. You got the telephone bridge and so on. She knew which, she'd worked on his teeth many times, and she knew where the real ones were, where the dentures were, and everything else. They then matched that up. So that was done before they didn't. She hadn't seen the remains. They hadn't seen the remains. So at that point, then they start to match it up with the remains that are in the shell hole. And they do. And Hitler's teeth are still in Moscow. You can, if you look online, you can find pictures of them on the internet. So Hitler's teeth, they match
because they take them
exactly.
back as sort of a gift.
They told them as a trophy.
They take them back as a kind of gift to Stalin.
Well, it's they actually sit in Moscow, supposedly in what's called the trophy archive, which is all the sort of the stuff that they've, the headline stuff that they've nicked over the years, and Hitler's teeth are supposedly in there, and they were photographed. It's a proper sort of official photograph of them, which is out there and is available. So again, to all those that think that Hitler escaped to South America in 1945, he did so without his teeth, which is not a great look.
So can you just sort of outline a couple of the main kind of conspiracies, and then and where they get their supposed, evidence from? Like what's giving this welly? The practical things, and then we'll talk about the reasons why there's like of why people want there to be a conspiracy. But what's the basis of it?
Well, for one thing, Hitler, in a sense, by the circumstances of his death, he kind of creates a fairly fertile ground for conspiracy because, for the reasons that we've mentioned, he wanted his body to be destroyed. So that sort of, the fact that you don't necessarily, unless, I talked about the teeth, but, the body was largely destroyed. There are also other bodies in the Reich Chancellery garden, which I think, complicates and muddies that sort of the forensic operation, which wasn't brilliant anyway. So all of that sort of feeds into Go on.
Sorry, is there an element by which also we're trusting the Soviets to tell us the truth? That's the next point. The Soviets are not.
That's the next point. So the first.
Sorry, I don't mean to steal your point.
Well, I know, God. I mean, will you just listen? No, I mean. So the first point is, the forensics are not great because it's the end of the war. Forensic science isn't that great. Hitler did everything he could to destroy his own body. So, okay, there are other bodies in the Chancellery Garden, all that stuff. So there's a muddying of the waters in the circumstances. The second point is that after the Soviets arrive, the first thing is they want to know, as I said, that, is Hitler dead, right? And there's a big investigation that I mentioned, Yelena Zhevskaya, and going after the dentist and the dentist assistants. They want to identify the remains. They want to make sure Hitler's dead. But then the order comes down from the top, from Stalin, basically to, okay, so we've ascertained that he's dead. So they actually announced that they found Hitler's body and he was dead. Okay, that was an official announcement. And then the sort of narrative begins to shift. And this is this sort of that liminal zone between, with the Grand Alliance between the end of the war and going into the Cold War, where Stalin begins to sort of change the narrative, where he said, well, was he dead? Did he die in Berlin? Or are you lot
Stalin starts playing
Yeah,
with
it starts from the top. Yeah, they change the narrative and they start to try to use Hitler's supposed survival as a weapon, as a stick with which to beat the West, right? And add into all of that we then later know that there were the rat lines, going through the Vatican and so on, with sympathetic. There was an Austrian bishop that was working in the Vatican. His name was Alois Hudal, and he was basically a Nazi. I mean, how you're a Nazi and a bishop, I'm not entirely sure, but he was. And he was helping, a lot of, lower level Nazis to get out. People like Mengele went out to South America. We know that, right? It's absolutely proven. We know also that there was a number of submarines. The last book I did, Wolfpack, I talked about a couple of the submarines that basically, when they're told to surrender, say no, we're not doing that, and they sail to Argentina. Right? There are two of them. So if you put 2 and 2 together with all of that detail and get 5, then that's what the conspiracy theorists are doing. So he's either escaping. A couple of days before he supposedly escapes, there are all this talk of tunnels, that he's escaping on tunnels to get to Tempelhof, to the airfield, and then he's going to fly out of Berlin. Or he's getting out to the north coast and he's going to go via submarine to South America. All of it. I mean, the problem with all of that is that aside from all the circumstantial side that we talked about just now, there's no evidence that any of that actually happened, right? No evidence at all. Whereas actually, the evidence for his death is very convincing. I mean, it is. Yeah. It's not perfect, but it's very, very convincing.
Why do you think then, Roger Moorhouse, that there is an appetite for Hitler to be alive?
It's a very good question. I think there's probably two things going on. On the one hand, I think there's it appeals to a certain mindset, which is that, nothing is quite as it seems. It's sort of a closed loop. We were talking the other day about, communist ideology as a sort of a closed system that explains everything. And I think in a way, a conspiracist mindset is kind of similar, because it gives you a sense of superiority, right? All you mugs, all you sheep, you all think that Hitler was killed, but I know the truth, right? It's that kind of. It's that mentality, right? It gives you a sense of intellectual superiority because you've joined all the dots. The fact that you've added 2 and 2 and got 6 doesn't matter, but in your mind you've joined the dots. So I think this is the conspiracy theory mindset, whatever it is, and this is one of the greatest conspiracy theories out there. I think is innately very, very seductive for a certain sort of person, right?
Yeah.
Beyond that, I think the second aspect is, I think, and increasingly this has come to the fore, on the the right and the sort of the, if you like, neo-Nazi right or Nazi adjacent right, where you've got Holocaust denial, right, which is also a denial of huge swathes of evidence that, Holocaust denial is intellectually absolutely untenable. It's nonsense. But there are still people that advocate for it, and I think this feeds into the same thing. It's another example of where, as they would put it, we've all been lied to. The standard narrative is not true. We know better, and I think the two actually, Hitler survival narrative and the Holocaust denial narrative, I think they kind of merge to some extent, or certainly it's like a Venn diagram where the same people would believe the same things. So
I've never really understood that, because I've always thought, if you're a neo-Nazi, why are you denying the Holocaust? Don't you want it to be true?
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, none of it makes any sense.
No, that's true.
Roger, I think we're kind of reaching our time limit, and I just want to nudge you to give us a couple of books that you think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot on this, as you can appreciate. There's some junk on this as well, it must be said. So I'm going to give some good ones, right? There's an old one, probably the oldest, which is a bit dated. This is Hugh Trevor Roper, who was British Army intelligence
Brilliant, yeah.
officer. He'd investigated this on the spot, in 46. I think the book came out in 46. So it's astonishingly early. The Last Days of Hitler, I've got my copy. It's a much later copy, but that's my copy there. It's still bloody good, it must be said, and it's beautifully written. There are minor points in it where circumstances and sort of later historians and so on have now kind of revised and so on. So it isn't the last word. It absolutely was the first word, and it's a bloody good first word. And as I said, it's beautifully written. Joachim Fest did a similar one in 1970s, 80s probably, which is again has a similar title. I can't remember. I couldn't find my copy on the only found the German copy, Senior. So sorry about that. I know. So he did another one. There's been other stuff. There was one by can't find it now. I think it was Ada Petrova and I think it was Peter Watson about Hitler's death, which was on the riffing on then and developing on the opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s. So that kind of incorporated some of that Soviet material. Whether it was right or wrong, I mean, again, there's a lot of Soviet material that was disinformation on this subject. So they try and pass all of that and sort of fit it into the narrative. And the last one that really needs to be mentioned on this subject is this one. Luke Daly-Groves, Hitler's Death, came out a few years ago. He goes into and demolishes the conspiracy theories around Hitler's death. And he does it with tremendous aplomb. Luke, I know, used to be tremendously kind of vehement on any sort of whiff of conspiracist nonsense around Hitler's death on Twitter, for example. He would go into bat and reply to these people and say, well, where's your evidence, and what about that? And it would just demolish them. He was so great to follow. It absolutely sort of destroyed the sort of conspiracist nests on Twitter that were trying to peddle this stuff. So the last one's Luke Daly-Groves, Hitler's Death. So between those three, I would say, Hugh Trevor Roper, Luke Daly-Groves, and Joachim Fest. I mean, that's a pretty good set of books on this subject, I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Roger. A tour de force, and we will leave Hitler and his horrible teeth with some delight in the garden of the Chancellery. Thank you very much.
Lovely.
On this day, 1945.